Hello coders! Today we're going to be talking about a topic that was brought up on the Discord server. That's howtocodewell.net/Discord if you want to join. This topic is about compromises. So when to accept a compromise. We're going to be talking about compromises in terms of your web development career, the technology that you might be using, the career paths and choices that you might be making, and fees that you might be taking or requiring. Let's start by talking about the technology. When should you compromise on the technology that you use? From my experience, the compromises are made during discussions about client budget, about the resources on hand, the time frame that you've got, the expertise within the team. So, for example, in my experience, let's just say client X wanted to have some very interesting way of searching huge amounts of data. Now, ideally, the golden standard, if you will, for that would be using something like Elasticsearch. So we would create a score against the stuff that we were searching through, and then we would return it in a really nice, suggested, relatable way. So you would be able to relate content to other content, and it would be very personalized to perhaps the user's own experience, the previous experience that the user has had on the site. However, that is actually quite a complicated thing to do. And when it came down to it, there was resources, technical knowledge amongst the team, there was time constraints, and all of that stuff. So it's always good to have the golden standard. If money was no object, if there was time was no object, if you had all the developers in the world working on this thing, then it's always good to aspire to that standard. However, you then have to make compromises, and you need to discuss, as I said, budgets, resources, time constraints, and all of that other things. And also, you need to be aware of the constraints of the current technology that you're using. In my experience, there's been times where I haven't been able to use not even the golden standard, just the normal standard, perhaps, because the technology that is currently in place doesn't allow for that. For example, it could be that the operating system that one is using doesn't support the versions of the things that you would like to do. So you need to be aware, first of all, of the constraints that you currently have, and then that includes, obviously, the constraints of the business, and then you need to map your solution to that. That is actually quite a challenging thing to do, because you need to do a whole plethora of investigation, discovery work, and you also need to see whether the team at the time is capable of achieving that golden standard. Golden standards are very rare from my experience. It's always nice to aspire to it. It's always nice to plan to get to that point, but there are many, many steps along the way, and there are many iterations in production before you can get to that point. Let's now talk about compromising on client fees. So this is where you're quoting for work, and then you're going through the negotiation process of the budget, working out how much you're going to be paid. How much do you want to be paid? What are the other benefits involved? This could also be when you are applying for a full-time job, a salary job, and you're trying to work out your pay and your benefits and so on and so forth. Now, this is going to be very different for different developers. I can't just say you should compromise on X if you're doing Y. This is not the same for every single developer. I'll just talk about it from my point of view, from my experience. So, it boils down for me to lifestyle choices. If I have to work in an environment where I'm there all of the time, then that isn't going to work for me. So, and notice I haven't mentioned money yet, because I regard having a better lifestyle as a developer far higher than having a very high salary. That's just something that I regard better. I have a series of health issues, which we won't go into here at all, And I prefer to have my own working space. I also would like I would also like to work on the How to Code Well channel. This is a big thing for me that I would like to do. So if I have to be in a place where I'm having to commute hours and hours and hours just to be in an office, just to be around developers, when I could have just done all of my work remotely, which I'm doing here, if I have to do that, then I would want to be paid far, far more than what I'm on now. And in fact, I wouldn't want to do that. I wouldn't want to make that compromise, because that would mean that, I won't be able to do the live streams in the morning. I won't be able to build the How to Code Well community. Obviously, you have to be in an office, right? So at some point, so as long as there is the ability and flexibility to work from home at some degree, then that is a good compromise that I would make. So let's talk about money and finance, because we haven't talked about that yet. In my opinion, a remote developer should not be valued any less than a developer that is always in the office, because the benefits of being remote isn't only for the developer. The developer is just one side of the coin. The client, the customer, the company that you're working for, they will also receive a benefit for having developers who are remote. And we're getting into another topic here, but, from a monetary kind of point of view, I don't see that working remotely should mean that you have to charge far less for what you do. However, there are times where negotiation does have to happen, and so you do have to make compromises and sacrifices. As a freelance developer, I think I've got a fairly reasonable daily rate. Yes, it has increased over time, because that's what you should do as you're more experienced. However, it's certainly not where perhaps it could be in terms of like the high-end stuff. And that's a compromise. That's something that I've chosen not to do. And the reason being is that I term this as chasing the check. I've spoken to many freelancers, many contractors who do this, and fair play to them. It's just something that I'm not interested in. This is where they look for work where it's high paying, high stress, and perhaps it's only work that is only for a couple of months. So they work on that, then they come off, and then they do something else, then they come off and they do something else. And that's fine if that's what they want to do. But the companies and the clients that they work for are really stressful, really, really stressful. You're playing with high amounts of money. You're playing with high amounts of stress. You're playing with lots and lots of people who are trying to have their own agendas. It's not something that I'm interested in. Not really. Yes, I know that I could be making an awful lot more money than I'm on now, but as I mentioned at the start of this video, personally, I think it's about lifestyle choice. I think it's about having the compromise of knowing that you don't have as much stress as you could be having, right? And if I'm being paid less for less stress, then that's a win. Because what are you going to do with all this money when you're really super stressed? It doesn't give you that much more enjoyment or happiness. So I'm not really interested in the high paying, high stress jobs of web development. That's not something that I would like to do. So in terms of fees, as I mentioned, I think I've got a fairly reasonable daily rate. Yes, it could be better. Yes, I've worked for less. However, I know that I could be working for far more, but in doing so, that includes a lot more stress. So I'm not particularly interested. And also, some of the clients that I've worked with, they just will not be swimming in the high-end, high-paying sort of area, because some of them have been non-profit, some of them have been charities. They give me a bigger fulfillment than the check at the end of the month or the end of the week, because you are working with a piece of software that is helping others and helping other people's lives get improved. And that to me is far more rewarding than being able to afford X, Y, and Z because you were treated as a resource in a very stressful manner. Let's talk about when you need to compromise on the quality of your work. This is a very interesting subject. In my opinion, as a freelancer, it boils down to the time that you're given, the resources that you're given, and the budget. Okay, because I deal with a lot of legacy code. Now, this could be that the developer who I'm taking over the project from doesn't work there anymore, or perhaps the project is so full of technical debt because of the decisions that were made previously, because of the constraints that the developers have had to work within the confines of those. Perhaps, for instance, we have half-baked code. This has all happened before, where the code hasn't hit production, but it's still in there. So it's like a feature flag that doesn't exist, but perhaps other features now rely on that feature, but because it hasn't been fully enabled, only half of that feature is working. Yes, this has happened before. And it becomes a little bit like a Jenga game where lots of pieces are missing and you're trying to add a piece on top of it whilst keeping the whole thing stable. So in terms of the code that you write yourself, in terms of the quality, I would say try and be as good quality as possible based upon the budget constraints, the time constraints that you're working within. There are 101 ways to do one thing. You want to be doing it in the most efficient way. You want to be doing it in a way that works with the other code, right? So you see if you can use and interact with the other bits and pieces. However, there is a level of compromise that one has to make, and that is if you're using code that someone else has written, perhaps they're not there anymore, or perhaps they are there, but they realized that this needs to be refactored anyway, and you're using a method call, and that method call, in your opinion, and perhaps the agreed opinion of the team, needs to be changed, right? Because it doesn't say what it's doing. Or perhaps the arguments are in the wrong order, or something like that. This has happened before. However, that method call that you need for your feature that you're adding right now, that method call is called in hundreds, if not thousands of other places that have nothing to do with the feature that you're working on. This has happened before. Do you refactor that method call and then refactor everything else? Or do you go, if I do that, I'm going to have to take on the responsibility of fixing all the other places and testing all of the other places as well. Do I have time for that? Usually the answer is no, because usually there isn't any tests in the first place, so that isn't going to happen. That becomes a compromise. You are now going to have to work with the legacy code, interacting with that, calling the legacy code methods, using their classes, using the objects, using and passing in arguments and parameters and so on, even if they don't actually sit right, even if they're not named correctly. But the compromise is that if you had to refactor all of this tough stuff, you would need to have more time to test all of that work. What I would say in that case is you need to, issue a red flag, wave that up and say, look, this is an issue. However, I can still work within the confines of what we've got here, but I still recommend that we refactor this work. So there's two outcomes there. Either the team comes back and says, we don't have time. So we understand that this needs to be changed, but we don't have time right now. Or, yes, we do have time. Or perhaps a third one is, we'll give you time after the project to do that. It does mean, though, that you have to go through an investigation period to actually investigate how bad the problem actually is. A lot of the work that I do is kind of like picking up stones and seeing what's under there, seeing what bugs are under there, and perhaps adding stones to those stones as well. So it is always a journey of compromise, especially if you're working on code that is already in existence and has lots of technical debt. How about, though, code that is you're just creating from scratch, right? So perhaps you've got a new project that's come in, and if you have, fantastic. What do? Again, you need to think about the time constraints that you're on. Again, you need to think about the budget that you're working within. One thing that is very tempting, and I have done this before, is when you take on a project, you go, oh, I quite like the new trending programming language, or I quite like the new trending framework. I'm going to write it in that, even though I've never used it before. You get yourself into so much pain when you do that, because you're not only having to build the project, you're learning how to build the project at the same time. I don't recommend doing that. However, if there's budget there, if there's time there, then yes, why not? Why not play with technology? Technology is changing all the time, and you need time to refine and hone down your skills and try out new technologies, because things change all the time. One thing that happened recently is PWAs. So I needed to find a project to learn how to write PWAs. It's very different if you're working in a full-time position, because this becomes a decision of the team. One thing that I'm trying to get better at is estimating time. So how long will it take me to do this thing? If this thing requires me to learn how to do this thing, it's going to take me far longer because I don't know how to do it yet, or I kind of know how to do it, but I don't know how to do it fully. And sometimes as developers, we can estimate really, really low because we think that we can do these things and we can't, or we don't appreciate the technical complexities or requirements or bits and pieces that we're not aware of at that time because we're discovering it as we go along. So what I'm saying here is, if you get a new project that comes in and the budget's small, the timeline is small, then perhaps it's best to look at what tools you currently have in your toolbox rather than trying to pick new ones off the shelf, because you're just going to be tripping over your feet, and that becomes stress, that becomes problematic. And at the end of the day, you're going to be the one, hopefully, who is maintaining this going forward. So try and I made a video before about comfort zones. This is where your comfort zone comes in. You know, what are you comfortable working in? You have a small budget. You have a small, tight deadline. Where's your comfort zone? That's where you should be in. If, for instance, the budget is huge, if the timeline is ginormous, then extend the comfort zone. Why not? What's the danger in doing that? The risk is limited based upon budget and time constraints. Before I go, I want to talk about the merch quickly. So we have some new designs for t-shirts and mugs and other awesome things. Check out howtocodewell.net/shop/merch. And secondly, I just want to say a massive thank you to those members in the Discord Pro Users channel for talking about this stuff and giving me ideas and suggestions for the content. If you've got any suggestions that you want me to cover in terms of videos in the future, then do let me know. Also, if you want to join the Discord channel, check out howtocodewell.net/Discord. We've got job boards. We've got coding challenges happening every month. We've got coding help challenges. We've got channels for pets, because of course we have Murphy here. And also we've got channels for coding resources and so on and so forth. It's a lovely little community that's being built there on the How to Code Well Discord channel. If I don't see you beforehand, I also stream Tuesdays, Wednesdays and Thursdays, as well as Sunday afternoons, usually around 14:30 GMT and then 7:30 in the morning on the weekdays. This is at twitch.tv/howtocodewell. Thank you ever so much for watching. Happy coding, everyone. I'll see you again soon. Cheers. Bye.